So, today I want to talk about tipping or gratuity in the restaurant business. The Trump administration has put forward a policy through the Department of Labor in one of its final regulations to make it so that servers and other workers who receive tips in restaurants can be required by employers to share said tips with any non tipped staff members. Specifically, we could think of cooks or dishwashers or janitors who work within a restaurant now receiving tips that the servers would be obtaining and having to share that in a pool. And the Trump administration has put forward that this would reduce wage disparities within restaurants and contribute to customers' experience. However, I don't think that's the case at all. And I'm going to explain why. But before I do, I want to discuss some of the history of tipping in the United States, as well as talk about this issue and why I think it's wrong and what it'll mean with the Biden administration coming into power. And then I want to talk about what exactly is the situation with tipping in the United States. Specifically, why it's important that we continue to tip while in the current economic situation, but also why we should move away from tipping as a general practice on a societal level, and because it does harm to workers. So I also need to address this. If you are not from the US, if you're specifically from Europe, your country might not have tipping as a practice, especially a mandatory practice. And I just want to put it out there that in the US, tipping is mandatory. If you are working for an employer in a restaurant, that employer is not paying your salary. The tips are paying your salary. You are only required to receive $2.13 an hour from your employer as a restaurant worker who receives tips. The tips are meant to take that and move you up to the $7.25 an hour that would represent an actual minimum wage. So your employer in that situation is much more akin to the customer than to the boss themselves. So with that said, going into the history of this, there are two slightly different positions of the history. One is seen as a more philosophical argument, and one is probably a more racist argument. And both of them come from a position where proprietors are actually anti-tipping. Business owners were against tipping as a practice. So the one more philosophical argument comes from the idea that in a society, it is actually anti-egalitarian in a democratic society for tipping to occur because it creates a power dynamic. The proprietors of restaurants who would see tipping occur actually saw it as a form of bribery. They saw it as a form of employees being able to be bribed to bring out extra food or an extra free drink to the customers, and that the customers were essentially committing an act of bribery towards their employees. This, however, changed when the Prohibition Amendment was passed in 1919. Hotels and restaurant industry businesses, who largely required alcohol sales to supplement their income, no longer had that available. And so they saw tipping as a way of getting themselves out of the financial burden they were placed in under Prohibition. And the practice just kind of never stopped. From that point forward, employees were paid by customers, not by employers. The other side of things comes from the South, where former slaves working in restaurants were placed in a position where tips could actually help them get a little bit ahead on any of their situation, to get more food, to possibly get out of the restaurant they were working in. But employers wanted to keep those former slaves in their place. And so they denied access to tips and created laws around this so that tips were no longer accessible. And so we have this dual issue of tips being paid to workers and how that can affect the living standard of a person. Where in one situation it's seen as this, bribery thing, and on the other side it's potentially used as a weapon to keep people down. So the reality of the situation now is that the Trump administration's policy probably won't end up staying around. The Biden administration will probably push it away. They can delay the enactment of it. It's not enacted for another 60 days from the time of it starting. And more than likely, the Biden administration will put forward its own plan. But the fact that Republicans are trying to put this through is actually important. The Republican policy on this, while it's disguised in this idea of creating fair wages for everyone, what it will actually do is allow employers to shift tips from one set of workers to another so they don't have to pay a full wage to their employees. Essentially, you have this case where if you are a server working in a restaurant and you would normally get a certain amount of tips, anything above that minimum wage is now being shared with the collective of everyone else, which means instead of an employer having to pay $7.25 an hour to the dishwashers or to the cooks or to the janitors, they can now pay the $2.13 an hour wage to those employees and take away any tips the servers would have gotten above the minimum wage and share the wealth. That hardly seems fair that we are meant to supplement the restaurant industry as consumers to pay the wages of employees when that's the job of the employer who's reaping all the profits in a restaurant. And again, the history shows that this was literally a policy to get out of having to pay people because restaurants could not afford to sustain themselves without alcohol as part of their business. So there's other issues that go into tipping and gratuity, besides the ones I've stated before. First of all, in the situation where $2.13 an hour is everything, I believe that it should be servers who are paid and are continued to be paid the wage that they're paid for the moment and time being, while everyone in the back who does the cooking and cleaning deals with this in the way that they have by receiving a proper wage from their employer. Don't let it go worse, because one of the other issues that can occur is those who are servers might be shifted around. Essentially, you'll have one worker covering serving and then doing dishes and then doing other things when the restaurant's not as busy. You can allow for that kind of discrepancy to happen also because the particular piece of procedure that was put forward by the Department of Labor actually allows for workers to shift their position and not have to spend 80% of their time specifically on tip-based jobs. So now you have the incentive to hire less people and to exploit your employees even more by shifting their job and not really having an idea what they're doing any given day. Again, this gives employers a lot of power by taking away employees' standards. So I think at the very least we should be maintaining the system. But I think we can do better. We should be shifting to a system that makes it so that employees are paid $7.25 at least, but of course just minimum wage in general, across the board. And then tip should be a generous offering that is given beyond that. And then it should also be included in prices, to be honest. There's a kind of a sneaky tactic in that you're given a bill and it represents, say, $10, but you're actually expected to pay $12 on that $10. Just make the price $12, like, a lot of other countries do, and get people used to the idea of paying that price. And then you can pay your employees an actual salary. And exemplary service can then be complemented by actually giving them a much higher wage and can still continue to be a practice. But then everybody's at least maintaining a certain level of status. And the other issue that comes into play with tipping, and this takes it even a step further, is that studies have shown that tipping does not actually help the performance of servers. As a matter of fact, when they feel like they have to perform for their money and they're constantly put on in that position, the level of fakeness and presentation they have to put out is, one, exhausting, and two, creates a situation where they're actually not behaving the best. And there are actually instances of people handing out free drinks and everything like that, which restaurant owners don't want. I personally don't think it's that big of a deal, but that's the kind of incentive that you're giving to your employees when their true boss is not the employer, but the customer. But more importantly, much more importantly, you have a situation where it creates an environment where people of color, young people, old people, and women, and people who are, not born in the United States, tend to be treated worse than white males in the business, both on the customer side and on the employee side. Basically, if you're with somebody who's perceived as not being able to or wanting to pay you as much, you give them worse service as a worker because you're only interested in the people who will be able to pay you more. Furthermore, if you're someone who's in that position as a white man coming into a restaurant, you might be more likely to treat your employees who are not white as well much worse and give them less tip because of that situation. So the power dynamics of society are amplified tenfold. Furthermore, you get a situation where sexual harassment and the power dynamic of men customers with women employees ends up creating a situation where you end up with women being put in very uncomfortable positions to try to maintain their job. And again, that's through sexual harassment, lewd comments, etc., that they will have to deal with. On top of that, you also get situations where employers in general already misallocate tips in these particular situations. Essentially, there are already cases of tips being stolen from people. And I think that we need to examine just how bizarre it is sociologically that working at a restaurant, your boss changes throughout the day as a server. Your boss is every single customer that comes through that door. You are not guaranteed anything from your employer above that $2.13 an hour unless it is to make up for the lack of tips. But if you're not getting enough tips, that's probably going to cost you your job. So you're put in this position where you're constantly having to figure out how to best serve the employer at the time. And so this policy by the Trump administration does not help. The history of tipping in the United States is clearly a subsidy for restaurants to, one, not pay their workers enough, and two, to allow racist policies to exist in restaurants that deny workers access to getting more than what the restaurant feels they deserve. And in the end, we should be sitting in a situation where, as a country, our workers are being paid a base level, and tip should be a generous gift that makes that much more. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my awesome Discord community in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.